Once again, Sarah Connor, 35, mother of two, brutally shot to death in her home this afternoon.
You're dead, honey.
Sarah Louise Connor. Is this right? A one-day pattern killer.
Go to a movie, kiddo. Okay, you and Matt have a good time. We will.
Sarah Ann Connor's secretary, 35, shot 6 times at less than 10 feet. Large caliber weapon.
I can hear it now. As you may call a goddamn phone book killer. All right, now listen, Miss Connor. Now listen carefully. You're in a public place, so you'll be safe till we get there, but stay visible.
Don't make a sound unless I say. Human. Sweat, bad breath, everything. Very hard to spot. I had to wait till he moved on you before I could zero him. He'll find her! That's what he does!
Terminator is out there. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear, and it absolutely will not stop. Ever. Until you are dead.
It's just him and me.
It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse, fear or pain. And it absolutely will not stop until you are dead. 1984 saw the release of The Terminator, being James Cameron's first blockbuster hit. Even to this very day, it is easily in my top 10 list of favourite movies of all time. It's an absolute masterpiece right down to the very core. It had a budget of a little over $6 million, which was quite small at the time, and ended up grossing $78 million at the box office, as well as making it a hit and putting director James Cameron on the movie-making map, as well as kickstarting Arnold Schwarzenegger's career as an action movie star. However, Arnold Schwarzenegger was already a star for winning Mr. Universe 7 times in bodybuilding and his work with Conan the Barbarian, but this greatly boosted his popularity. A short piece of a war-torn future is showcased during the opening titles during 2029, stating a dystopian world and society not run by people but instead by machines and artificial intelligence. After the opening titles are finished, it then cuts to the present in 1984 Los Angeles. A man's truck begins to disrupt and notices a ball of lightning nearby, and begins to form, and he flees, not knowing what is to come next. As the ball of lightning begins to fade away, a tall masculine figure emerges from the ball, only it's not a man, it's a cyborg, known as the T-800 Cyberdyne Systems Model 101, or simply known as the Terminator. It emerges and overlooks the city of LA. The T-800 approaches some punks and who aren't taking him seriously, considering he's naked, and he asks them for their clothes. And one of them curses at him, saying, "Fuck you, asshole," with a pocket knife drawn out. So, like a proper working class man should do, the T-800 pushes one of them onto his feet and gets stabbed, but it doesn't do anything, so the Terminator literally impales his fist into the other guy who stabbed him, killing him instantly, and the other, horrified, immediately takes off his clothes. Another electrical-like ball of lightning erupts in an alleyway, but this time it's not a Terminator, it's a man. He ends up stealing pants from a homeless man and gets in a chase with a cop, who then disarms him and then grabs his pistol and asks for the date and year. In conclusion, that means he's from the future. He makes a run into a store steals a jacket, shirt and shoes and climbs out through a window, down a ladder and grabs a shotgun in the unattended police car. The next day in the film, we're introduced to a young waitress known as Sarah Connor, who's struggling to find her feet both as an individual and a worker. Like most of us, she has trouble balancing her paycheck. After a bit of a frustrating day at work, she returns home in order to get ready for a date. During the day, the Terminator visits a gun store to acquire quote-unquote home defense. Earlier on, he breaks into a car and hotwires it to make his way to the phone booth and searches for Sarah Connor. He pulls up onto Sarah Connor's property only to burst open the door and then gun her down, only then to realise later on that it is in fact the wrong Sarah Connor. The man who emerged from the other ball of lightning, known as now Kyle Reese, was sleeping in a car that he found and had a dream about the war-torn future between man and machine raging on. He wakes up and realises he should be going to find Sarah Connor. Meanwhile, Sarah and her roommate Ginger are getting ready for their dates. Sarah's date leaves a message saying that he can't make it. The disappointed Sarah leaves the house to Ginger and her date while she goes out for a pizza. While out, she hears another TV broadcast about another Sarah Connor killing. At this point in time, she catches on and then looks in the phone book and finds out that she is in fact the next target. She begins to make her way to a dance club known as Tech Noir because she feels like she's being followed by somebody, and that somebody is Kyle Reese. The Terminator assumes that Sarah Connor will be in her home, so he breaks through the sliding doors and murders both Ginger and her date. Seconds after the attack, Sarah leaves a message at the worst possible time, giving her location and also having the Terminator find her ID. Sarah this time makes another call to the police, and claiming that someone is out to get her, and she's told to stay where she is. The Terminator enters the dance club and of course doesn't pay. While everyone is dancing, he glances around for Sarah Connor. Sarah finally comes face to face with Kyle Reese, believing he's the one that's trying to kill her. And then, the Terminator glances over and finally finds her. He begins to slowly walk towards Sarah Connor, and then pulls out a pistol, taking his aim. However, Kyle notices and pulls out his sawn-off shotgun and shoots him several times until he drops. This strategy proves to be ineffective. Though it did knock him over, he is not wounded in the slightest. He stands back up and pulls out an SMG and tries to shoot Kyle, but misses and thought that he'd retreated, and then he proceeded to attack Sarah again, and then again had several rounds loaded into him by Kyle, sending him flying out the window. Kyle approaches the shocked Sarah and tells her to come with him if she wants to live, into which she does, even at first being stubborn. They make a run for it outside with the Terminator hot on their trail. Kyle blows up another car in front of the Terminator. It explodes, but the Terminator jumps out of the flames, landing on the hood of the car while steaming and his eyebrows burnt off and his hair looking a lot shorter. The Terminator rams his fist through the windshield of the car, grabbing Sarah Connor trying to kill her, but Kyle swerves, throwing the Terminator off the hood, giving them time to escape. The Terminator then approaches the disoriented cop and then kills him in the process, and then decides to impersonate him in order to find Sarah Connor more easier by sending in reinforcements. Sarah, in disbelief, leads Kyle to keep on evading the authorities and explains more about the cyborg from the future, saying that 40 years from now, everything around them is gone due to a nuclear attack from an artificial intelligence called Skynet would take control of all the nukes and kill 3 billion people. The machines soon became known as the Terminators because of their infiltration tactics. Kyle then went on to say that the humans that were left alive got captured and were put to work by the machines to make more machines and use their skin for more Terminators. When all future hope for humanity seemed lost, a man rose from the ashes and formed a resistance against the machines and Skynet. His name was John Connor, and Kyle told Sarah that that's her unborn son, and that's why her survival is so important, and that's why she has been targeted for termination. Sarah and Kyle ditch the current car that they're in order to try and escape, but the Terminator shows up and opens fire on the back window. The Terminator then attempts to shoot Kyle, but Kyle then leans out first and then shoots the Terminator in the face, severely damaging his eye and distracting the machine, and then crashing into a wall at full speed. And then Kyle quickly takes the wheel and swerves away from the wall and sees the cops approaching. And he is about to get out and fight, but Sarah stops him, saying that he'll be killed. And then he stands down and gets taken into custody, with the Terminator nowhere to be seen. While at the police station, Sarah unfortunately learns the shocking truth and fate about her friend Ginger and her boyfriend, and breaks down. She's introduced to a criminal psychologist by the name of Dr. Silberman, who is out to determine whether Kyle is crazy or not. Meanwhile, the Terminator enters an apartment and reveals his disfigured eye and arm. He grabs a scalpel and begins cutting and removing excess skin to make his arm function properly. Kyle lays down everything to Dr. Silberman as to why he's here, as well as adding more of a backstory on Skynet, saying it became self-aware and that's the cause of the nuclear attacks and how the machines took over. He then says that the reason that the Terminator was sent back was because it acted as a failsafe or a last resort to win the war, because Skynet's defense grid was smashed and the machines had lost, and that's why Kyle was sent to protect her. He then says that the Terminator nor he can return to the future because of the technology. Kyle then demands to see Sarah because he gets sick of repeating himself and gets taken away. All of this was captured on tape and then shown to the police and Sarah, and then gets turned off because he gets more aggressive and starts saying all the Terminator will do is find her and rip her heart out. Silberman describes Kyle Reese as a loon, with one of the lieutenants showing her body armor, and that's how the Terminator got back up, and how he punched through a windshield was because he was under the influence of some sort of drug, so he wouldn't have felt a thing, and he would have broke every single bone in his body on impact. The Terminator grabs some gargoyle sunglasses to cover up his eye, and leather jacket to cover up his arm wounds. He then grabs an assault rifle and a shotgun and heads for the police station. Into which the Terminator then responds to the cop by saying,
"I'll be back."
He then drives his car through the doors, killing the cop, and begins to gun down every single cop in the police station. One of the guards gets told to watch Kyle as he's locking the door. Kyle rams into him and knocks him out, and frees himself with the guard's keys, and proceeds to find Sarah. The awoken Sarah hears everything, and she runs into a room and runs behind a desk, thinking, this is it. She looks through the glass after the power was cut by the Terminator and sees a little silhouette, believing that it's the Terminator, and hides again, but then he enters and it turns out it's Kyle. He grabs her by the hand and runs along outside with her, and the Terminator sees them fleeing and opens fire, but fails to kill them, and Sarah and Kyle get away once more. Kyle and Sarah camp outside underneath a bridge, and Sarah realizes that Kyle has been shot, and she wraps a cloth around his wound. She then begins to feel uncertain about her future, and then Kyle tells her something that John Connor made him memorize what it was so he could pass it on to her in the present. Sarah then falls asleep in Kyle's arms and then has a dream about the future, with Kyle and the Resistance gathering food for each other, and then their dogs begin to bark, and a Terminator with a minigun opens fire on them, emerging from the fog. She then wakes up saying that it was a dream about dogs, and Kyle says that he uses them to spot They set on foot again to find a place to stay where the Terminator won't suspect to look, so they head for a motel. The Terminator looks through some of the notes that he took from Sarah's house and sees her mother's address. One of the people in the apartment knocks on the door and asks if there is a dead cat in there due to the rotten flesh, and to which he replies with,
"Fuck you, asshole."
It's the phrase that he learned from the punks trying to blend in more with the humans. He then grabs his weapons and heads for Sarah's mother's house. Meanwhile, Kyle leaves the motel to gather food and supplies and strictly tells Sarah not to contact anybody or tell anyone where they are. Unfortunately, she receives a call from someone who she thinks is her mother and claims she's worried sick about her. Sarah then tells her where she's staying at the motel, and then she says that she loves her, and then the Terminator says that she loves her too. He then makes a call to the motel asking for the address. Kyle returns with supplies and explosives to take out the Terminator, and he's getting treated for his wounds by Sarah. She then asks if he had someone special, like a lover, in the future, and he said no. She felt sorry for him, and then he confessed his feelings and then said, I travelled across time for you, Sarah. Later on, they felt a lot happier and a lot of tension had been relieved, which is a good thing considering what had been going on, but it didn't last. Kyle heard the dog bark and he knew immediately the Terminator had found them. He grabbed weapons and explosives and he and Sarah made a run for it. The Terminator busted through the door, immediately opening fire, only to realise that they had fled the scene. He rushes back outside only to get rammed by Kyle, who had stolen another car and drove off with Sarah. The Terminator jumped on his motorbike and then gave chase. The Terminator opened fire and missed the first few times as Kyle began throwing explosives at the Terminator but then kept missing. Kyle then pulled out another explosive in an attempt to blow up the Terminator, but the Terminator opens fire and then gets shot. Badly wounded, Sarah tries to speed off but couldn't as the Terminator was right on their trail. He hit the supporting rail of the highway by accident and then flew off his motorbike. The motorbike then slid underneath the car, ended up flipping Sarah and Kyle in the air and rolling the car over. The Terminator, now with the sunglasses off, showed nearly half of its skin torn off, showing the metal endoskeleton underneath, and then got hit by the truck but went under and grasped it from underneath. The driver, thinking he had hit someone, stopped and was about to get out, but then the Terminator entered the truck and then told him to. Without hesitation, the driver immediately jumped out of the car. The Terminator then stepped on it, trying to squash Sarah and Kyle as they were still in the tumbled car. Sarah pulled Kyle out of the car just in the nick of time. The Terminator smashed the car up. Kyle managed to get back on his feet and he and Sarah ran the opposite direction and the Terminator turned around. The hot pursuit continued on. Kyle then slowed down to chuck one of his explosives into the exhaust pipe of the truck. The Terminator was getting closer by the second when it was just about on Sarah's tail until the truck blew up, and as Kyle jumped into the dumpster for cover, the road went up in a ball of fire. Sarah dives for cover and then turns around and sees the Terminator covered in flames as he jumps out of the truck. He then collapses to his knees and falls flat, stumbling around looking for Kyle, who eventually emerges from the smoke, and then the two embrace each other, thinking they had once and for all killed the Terminator. From the debris, a metal figure emerges. Kyle and Sarah look over and realise the Terminator, in fact, still functions. The Terminator, who is also having trouble walking, begins limping towards Kyle and Sarah, who make a desperate run into a factory. Kyle manages to block the entrance with a metal bar, causing the Terminator to keep ramming and hit the door. Sarah and Kyle continue to make their way through the factory. With Kyle lost a devastating amount of blood, he begins to faint and he collapses. Sarah grabs him and tells him to find his feet, clearly showing that she's having to start to make a few changes if she wants to survive. The Terminator bursts through the door, but Sarah and Kyle are nowhere to be seen. Slowly and quietly hobbling around the factory, Sarah accidentally triggers one of the machines, revealing their location. Sarah and Kyle get cornered at some stairs and Kyle tells Sarah to run. He uses the metal bar to try and knock the Terminator's head off, but it does nothing. The Terminator then smacks him across the face, sending him off his feet and leaving a wounded face. The Terminator then begins to chase Sarah again, but Kyle pulls out his last explosive and wedges it in between the gap in the Terminator's leg. Kyle tries to roll down the stairs and away from the blast, but he is caught within the blast. Sarah, tumbling over, pulls the metal bar out of her leg, leaving her crawling over to Kyle and flipping his body over to find him dead. In disbelief, she began to sob all over his body. However, all was not over. Suddenly, the top half of the Terminator begins crawling over to Kyle's body and tries to grasp Sarah. Sarah crawls in between the gaps of a machine where the Terminator follows. Sarah then pulls down a cage, thinking that the Terminator won't get her, but it wedges its arm through the gaps and tries to reach out for her. Sarah, panicking, reaches her left arm to the left and finds a control panel. She looks into the eyes of the Terminator and says,
You're a terminated fucker.
She then presses the button of the machine that the Terminator is underneath and crushes it, but leaves its arm still intact. Sarah then bursts into tears. Kyle gets zipped up in a body bag and gets taken away by another ambulance, and as she begins to faint in the bed, she says, "Kyle," and gets taken away into another ambulance. Sarah comes out of the hospital and makes a detour to Mexico. Now pregnant with Kyle's son, she records audio vlogs on her reflections on what's happened to her, and for her unborn son John Connor to see. She stops by the local service station to get a refuel for fuel. She gets her photo taken, which is the same one that John gave Kyle in the future. One of the kids say to her that the storm is coming. She replied with, "I know." She then departed and drove off. Even to this very day, it's still one of the most thrilling action, sci-fi, and even horror movies to ever desecrate the big screen. The pacing in this film is just phenomenal. Though Harlan Ellison, the writer of the 60s TV flick called The Outer Limits, liked the Terminator, but filed a suit against it claiming it was too similar to the episodes of his show called Soldier and The Demon with a Glass Hand, Orion Pictures didn't want to be sued, so they gave Harlan Ellison an undisclosed amount of money, and in later prints of the film, an acknowledgement saying that they took inspiration from the episodes. For a $6.4 million budget film, the effects at the time were very impressive, a combination of both practical and puppetry effects. Most of the effects hold up incredibly well today, with the exception of the puppet Arnold repairing himself and the jerky stop motion of the Terminator endoskeleton. Mind you though, it improved as the movie progressed. As far as presentation goes, it's up there with the likes of the original Star Wars trilogy. The late Stan Winston showcased his genius talents with bringing the Terminator to life, which actually came in the nightmare of James Cameron, and that's what gave him the idea for the film. The film's score and original soundtrack that has been composed by Brad Fiedel has become as iconic as the Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Mario and Halo themes, with the Terminator's heartbeat and Sarah and Kyle's love theme mixed in with it. Some of my favourite tracks are the main theme, the cop shootout, and of course, Burning in the Third Degree, which is in the tech noir scene, which made it so much more iconic, and the build-up was just phenomenal. The sound design as a whole is fantastic too. The gunshots sounded great in the 1984 version, and in the later versions they still sound great, though they were slightly altered, but for the better in my opinion. Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator was his gateway to Hollywood and becoming one of the greatest action heroes of all time. Though he was already a star from winning Mr. Universe title in bodybuilding 7 consecutive times and his role in Conan the Barbarian, the Terminator to this day is considered one of his most iconic movie roles. Funnily enough, Arnold heard about the script and was interested in playing Kyle Reese, but when he met up with James Cameron and read the script, he wanted to play the Terminator. Which in all fairness, I wouldn't have had it any other way. His presence made us all even cheer for him despite him being the villain, which directors find hard to do, but with Arnold's physique and interpretation, he absolutely nailed it. Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor was great too. It showed that female characters can be equally as charismatic and intelligent just like their male counterparts, which was rare to see in films back then. Her character development was fantastic, right from being uncertain but then also determined at the end to fight for what's right. Michael Biehn as Kyle Reese was perfect. He's a very much underrated actor, but thankfully James Cameron used his talents again in some of his later films. It's a shame that Hollywood never really exposed his talent. The other supporting actors were good in their roles too, and even Earl Bowen, who played Dr. Silberman, makes cameos in the first 2 sequels. The Terminator was praised by viewers and critics alike. It remained at number 1 in the box office for 2 weeks, and that's outstanding considering it's an R-rated movie. And it grossed $78.4 million, making it one of the international hits and putting James Cameron on the movie-making map. So far, 4 sequels have been released upon the success of the first film, the second film being directed by James Cameron again, titled Terminator 2 Judgment Day. It hit theaters in 1991. A 3D ride was opened in 1997, which served as a mini-sequel to Terminator 2, but then sadly eventually closed in 2012. The rights to the franchise was bought out, and the third movie was instead developed by Jonathan Mostow, entitled Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, which was released in 2003. It was successful, but not as well received as the previous installments. The Terminator rights got sold again, and this time the director of the next installment was MCG, and the film was titled Terminator Salvation, and the first film not to star Arnold Schwarzenegger. The film was released in 2009, and in my opinion was the worst entry of the franchise to date, considering its poor execution and the absence of Arnold Schwarzenegger due to being in office as Governor of California. The rights got sold again and then ended up in the hands of Skydance, who then produced Terminator Genisys, which was released in theaters 2015. And it was supposed to serve as the first in a new trilogy while paying homage to the first two films. Despite its reception by the critics and a disappointing performance at the box office, a handful of viewers were happy, despite the plot twists being revealed in the trailer. I love this entry, and in my opinion is the best Terminator movie since Terminator 2, and it shows that Arnold Schwarzenegger can still play the role of the Terminator perfectly, even at nearly 70. The Terminator remains one of the most successful franchises of all time, and the first two movies are definitely in my top 10 list of favourite movies of all time, and still to this very day stands the test of time despite showing a bit of age. The rights to the Terminator franchise revert back to James Cameron in 2019, and even though I doubt he'd make another movie, but there's still always hope. If he decides not to go ahead with making more Terminator films, I'm still happy with the first two entries in the franchise. If you haven't seen the Terminator, I recommend watching it immediately, and if you've already seen it, I hope I got you excited to watch it again.
It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity, remorse, or fear. It absolutely will not stop until you are dead.
That's what he does! That's all he does! You understand?
Why me?
I didn't do anything.
No, but you will.
Can you stop it?